Hey class, welcome back. Welcome to lab number 17. So what you read before class today was the ego depletion study by Baumeister and colleagues. And today we're going to be talking about that study in general, but we're also going to be talking about subsequent studies that have come after it to talk about whether they proved, disproved, or found new things about ego depletion in general. So really what the point that we're going to go today is that when we fail to independently confirm the computations or results of a previous study, so in this case the ego depletion study, some fear that this might be a symptom of a lack of rigor in science, while there's a little bit of kind of other people who think that others argue that such an observed inconsistency can be important precursor to new discovery. So we're going to talk about the ego depletion study and a lot of studies that have been done afterwards, and we're going to talk about things like meta-analyses and why they're so important to research. So this is the part in the class we would normally have some sort of discussion of the Baumeister et al. Study where they talked about ego depletion, but of course, given the current circumstances, we're not able to do that. But just remember, on Canvas, there is a kind of quiz about the reading that you're expected to fill out. It's about 21 questions, I believe. So if you haven't already done that, it's supposed to be done before class, but we'll go ahead and let it slide this time if you haven't done it yet. But just remember that there are some things that need to be done prior to the class, which I will have expectations for. But let's talk about what ego depletion is and what Baumeister and colleagues were talking about when they were talking about the ego depletion. So in brief, depletion theory, as Baumeister and colleagues argue they argue that the act of self-regulation, in this case in the study, was the idea of between radishes and cookies. So the act of self-regulation deeply a limited resource on self-regulation. And so in this case, like a resource of self-regulation would be something like glucose, that would kind of give you energy and so forth like that, making people less able to exert self-regulation in a subsequent task. So that means when you are using self-regulation on, controlling yourself from not eating cookies or something, or candy as in the study, then in a subsequent task, you're going to be unable to perform or exert any kind of energy because you've depleted your resources from that. So depletion theory focuses on situations where a person is in conflict in performing a task such as, the cookies, in variance with past habits and their ability to perform on a subsequent task. So let's say, for example, like the Stroop task, which is the task where you need to identify colors and name them, name the color while it's in a different coded color. Will the performance on a previous task will have variance on the next task, for example, the Stroop task, which will deplete your energy and leading to poorer performance and a less focus on those subsequent tasks. So in their study, Baumeister and colleagues, they claim that this really only takes, I believe in the study it was about 15 minutes or something like that, that they went from the kind of looking at the cookies to doing the next task. So they made the claim that this depletion works within about 10 minutes, and that's all you need to have ego depletion to occur. So as I discussed in the first slide, we're going to go beyond the Baumeister et al. Study today, and we're going to talk about where it's been utilized in other research as well. So I'd like to start off in talking about how it's been utilized in industrial organizational research, otherwise known as IO research, IO psychology, right? So in IO psychology, researchers have often been studying ego depletion in the context of how managers are affected by it. So how does this affect manager productivity, their commitment, their helpfulness to other employees? So one study by Laneige in 2014 indicated that leaders or managers who are a type of leader, oftentimes, or I should say are expected to be a type of leader, Laneige 2014 found that leaders who have to respond to the direct requests of employees, rather than being kind of in a separate category, oftentimes they are resulted in having less creativity and less work engagement because they are having this depleted resource, because they're having to work from the demands of their actual employees. So if you think about it in this terms of the under is actually kind of in a way demanding the upper by giving tasks to them. So if it's switched, the managers have less depleted ego resources. And then another area that we've seen ego depletion kind of result in is risk aversion. And so when I'm talking about risk aversion, I mean that they will not even participate in any sort of risky behaviors because of the ego depletion. And the way that it works is that they say, according to the research, is that oftentimes they are too tired to even take on the risk of the activity that they have participated in. So it's not a matter of being afraid to take risk. It's actually more of a matter of the ego depletion has resulted in tiredness to even take on the risk in general. So another way, and let's go ahead and take a step over to kind of more of a neurology, neurocognitive approach. Hopefully there's a few people in the class who are interested in that kind of area of research that we can study ego depletion is through the course of blood glucose levels. Now, blood glucose levels, so this is kind of sugar, kind of things that glucose is kind of this found resource for energy. The brain needs it as well as the rest of the body needs glucose in order to function. So it's assumed that glucose is this mediating effect from ego depletion to them doing a certain task of some sorts. So ego depletion can decrease your blood glucose levels by utilizing that resource, and it needs that glucose level in order to participate in certain tasks. So a little bit of kind of background is that we know the brain uses, on average per day, 120 grams of glucose. This isn't something I just made up. This is actually from research that about 120 grams of glucose is needed for the brain to function. That is about half of what your entire body utilizes overall. So take this into context. Your brain itself utilizes half of all the glucose that is generally needed for your body to function and to create energy. But another thing about the brain is that it doesn't have an ability to store glucose like the rest of your body does. So what happens is your brain has the ability to instantaneously grab glucose from the body whenever it's needed, and it can call this on high demand too. So it really prioritizes itself over the body. So even if the body has so much glucose stored, it will demand that I will take this despite what you need in order to participate in this the glucose need. So the brain takes priority even in non-normal circumstances and normal circumstances. So when we're talking about ego depletion, there's really three types of questions that come from this. So how much glucose does a 5 to 10 minute cognitive task require, like that is used in the ego depletion tasks studied in these types of experiments? So how much glucose are we needed to do that, and how much does ego depletion partake in using up our glucose? Additionally, for number 2, how much glucose depletion does it take to make a difference in cognitive capacity? And finally, for our last kind of question that we're able to ask from this is, well, how fast does the brain replenish from this glucose activity that's been utilized? It takes it, how much does it need, and how fast can we replenish the energy needed from ego depletion? So we're not really sure if these questions have been answered. And furthermore, glucose blood level is not the same as brain glucose level. So what that means is how much of our brain glucose levels should be measured to participate in this energy utilization that we use for ego depletion. So now that I've actually told you about all the relationships between brain glucose levels and blood glucose levels and how it relates to ego depletion and tiredness as glucose being a mediator between the two, what I'm going to tell you now is that there's actually been subsequent research by Vadillo, Gold, and Osman that was conducted in 2016. So as you notice, we're actually going up the ladder as far as years and becoming more and more recent, has actually kind of disproven this theory and said that if this method of measuring blood glucose levels is valid, so we have to keep in mind, is our actual measurement valid, then what they say is that these results indicate that the glucose theory is not a reliable source to talk about the connection between ego depletion and tiredness. So there's actually a failure in understanding how this is proven. So they're saying that if glucose is a valid measure, then we're not seeing this actual resource. And they did that through a p-curve analysis, which is just a fancy way of looking at what levels of significance can we associate with that. Our mediator is kind of what all it's saying. So they started they started looking at past research and started conducting new research as to what other physiological mediators might have a suggested indicator of ego depletion and tiredness overall. So a couple of the kind of ways that they've looked at it is one of them would be heart rate variability. So if you have a rise in heart rate, is that associated with later tiredness? And blood pressure is another one. So increases in blood pressure would be associated with more later on ego depletion and tiredness. And other kind of brain area activities that we're not going to kind of get into detail. But overall, what we're saying is that there might be other ways of indicating the mediated effect between ego depletion and tiredness overall. And what they're saying is that we need to control for this mediator to understand how this actually works and what the clear relationship is. But for now, this blood glucose and brain glucose kind of way of looking at it isn't really cutting it. So one way that we said is, okay, maybe we need a better clarification as to what ego depletion is, right? So or even what glucose depletion is, right? What is it that defines glucose depletion? So we've known for decades now that fatigue undermines life in many different ways, right? So fatigue is if you're tired or you're fatigued, then you can't perform tasks nearly as well as you can if you were awake. However, unlike the ego depletion study by Baumeister, where they were talking about fatigue within about 10 minutes, right? Saying, okay, ego depletion can take effect in 10 minutes. That's not how we've looked at it in past decades about how fatigue actually comes. Fatigue can come from things like long hours of work, illness, psychological problems. Even working out can lead to fatigue in the long run. Illness is another thing that will lead to fatigue. And more things that can lead to fatigue. But what we can tell is that those types of fatigue are generally longer continuous problems, as opposed to this short-term duration that the Baumeister and colleagues, essentially, and you'll notice I keep referring to experiment 1 within the Baumeister one, because I really think that really just defines kind of what they're looking at. But the differences between the being told to eat radishes versus cookies, which just took about 10 minutes in their claim. So we're thinking it's not really that good of an indication to say that ego depletion can happen this quickly, as their study states. So it's not necessarily the best strategy in this case, in this 5 to 10 minute depletion method, to look at physiological moderators, maybe is what we're thinking. So, or mediator, so mediator or a moderator, whatever works best. I kind of think of it more in terms of a mediator because it's mediating the effect between ego depletion and tiredness or fatigue. But what we're finding is that, the relationship between the mind and the brain, so you remember the difference between that kind of physiological versus kind of the mind kind of aspect, it's pretty complex. So we need to think about ideas that don't have these kind of physiological benefits that we can see that we would expect to see within 5 to 10 minutes or 10 minutes overall in causing fatigue, that the Baumeister and colleagues paper makes claims to. So a more productive strategy, as opposed to these physiological measures, might be looking for these psychological moderators or mediators first. So now that I've shown you that really the physiological mediators might not be the best understanding of why ego depletion occurs and may lead overall to fatigue, we can talk about something that us as maybe more social psychologists are a little bit more comfortable with, which is psychological indicators of that, right? So these are things like expectations of fatigue, which is what we're mostly going to be talking about here. In its relationship from ego depletion to fatigue, um, is that a good mediator between the two? So, a study by a researcher called Job, so I don't know if it's pronounced Job or Job, in 2010 found kind of the series of studies in which they found actually that if a individual views self-regulation as a limited resource, then they were predicted to better self-regulate and become less fatigued as time went on. So during heightened periods of stress. So this means that they would view, let's say, for example, watching TV, if they knew that their kind of self-regulation was a indicator of how they'll perform in later things, they might perform better on a test. So if they were to limit their amount of watching TV because they view it as kind of going towards their limited resources of energy levels, then they might study for a test a lot better and then perform better on final exams. So these results kind of go nicely with other research that demonstrates that the beliefs about depletion effects are more likely to be caused by people's beliefs about depletion than by the actual depletion experimental task. So what it's saying is that the beliefs and the expectations you have towards your depleted resources might be more related to your later energy levels or fatigue in general. So the relationship between one's beliefs and the abilities to are related to the abilities to overcome depletion or fatigue in later things. So, for example, your self-efficacy to so pretty much self-efficacy might be related to overall lower depletion of fatigue, lower fatigue in general. So but we've actually found that depletion beliefs are not the only psychological mediator or moderator that have been found. A study by Brockner in 2016 described other moderators, including positive mood, self-affirmation, beliefs about importance of the second task. So this is like the first task being you watching TV, the second task studying for an exam, right? So if you have higher beliefs in that studying for an exam is more important than it is for watching TV, then that would really kind of be a better predictor of understanding your depletion, your fatigue later on. Money incentives have also been shown. So if you were to give someone money to study for a test, which I will never do for you, but if you were to give someone money to study for a test, yeah, it might be more likely they'd study for the test. So, you know, that's kind of the overall focus on this, is that this really we need to focus on more psychological measures to understand, because especially when we're talking about things like 5 to 10 minute difference in fatigue from some sort of ego depleting task would be a better indicator of the psychological measures would be a better indicator overall. So another really important kind of psychological mediator that's been discussed in the literature is one that's fairly recently been studied. So this is done by Dennis and Locke, and this was performed in 2017. So as I said, pretty recent, so only 3 years ago. They found that really one big moderator of the relationship between task in ego depletion and fatigue is the performance goal, the expectations of the goal that is in mind. So what they're saying is that something that has a kind of more severe consequence or associated with it, so a higher stakes goal, would experience less ego depletion than the one that has a lower stakes goal. So people feel less tired if the goal that is the achievement or the goal at the end has higher stakes in the end, as opposed to one that had lower stakes in the end. And they did this by, they would have participants go through a kind of brainstorming task. So this would be some sort of simple thing where they say, put down a list of everything that you can do with a pencil. So you can write things down. You can, I don't know, do that fun thing where you kind of make it look like rubber or something like that. And then immediately following this task, they would have participants that were in an experimental condition as opposed to a control condition participate in a self-regulation depletion task. In this case, it was called the white bear task, in which participants would write down all their thoughts when being told not to think of a white bear. So if you've seen Inception, there's that scene where he says, "Oh, think of pink elephants. Try not to think of pink elephants. What are you thinking of now?" And all you can think about is pink elephants. So it's essentially the same task where you're supposed to write down your thoughts without thinking of the white bear, even though you've been told not to think of the white bear. The validity of that actual study, I'm not really sure. I couldn't really tell you, but it's interesting nonetheless. So the participants in the experimental condition and the control condition were both told afterwards to write down their thoughts following this task. Now, the participants in the control condition were not given the white bear task, whereas participants in the experimental condition were given the white bear task. But after the white bear task for those, then they would ask individuals to they would randomize participants to either participate in kind of a higher stakes task versus a lower stakes task. And they found that those that were in the lower stakes task did experience ego depletion. They were a little bit more tired when they're setting that, whereas those were given the higher stakes task. So this would be something like setting goals for yourself. They didn't experience as much ego depletion in those studies. So keep in mind, it's really associated with how high stakes this goal is that might be associated with ego depletion. So you might be asking, like, why is it so important to study these psychological moderators as opposed to physiological moderators, which, oftentimes seem more concrete and so forth? Well, these psychological moderators are very relevant to daily life, right? These are things that we experience every day. And the ability for people to mobilize their psychological energy when they believe something is personally important to them or significant as at stake is something that's commonly experienced in everyday life. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to focus on this as well. And a lot of researchers have focused on this as well. So it's not a matter of always the task or situation, but rather it's all about what the goals are, right? And if you have boredom or disinterest in the goal, well, yeah, of course you're going to have ego depletion and fatigue towards that goal because it's not as interesting or anything like that. But other researchers have not really found evidence for this effect. So really, again, we're running into this problem like, oh, well, replication problems again, which is a common theme for this class, that we always find that there's replication problems. And this is a big problem when you have small effect sizes and small sample sizes that you can't replicate these effects. So some other research found that, they were unable to replicate these goals. Really, that's just the overall story of it, is that we aren't able to see that. And what they say is that originally this study was probably underpowered overall, which it only had about 78 participants. So it might explain why we're seeing such significant results. This might be one of those kind of odd studies that just found significant results with an underpowered study, part of that 5% range that a p-value tells us, yes, you will find these significant results regardless. So we're going to explore this replication issue soon, but first we want to discuss meta-analyses and how it's told us about the ego depletion effect overall, and what have this study of studies talked about in regards to this. So in this part of the class, we normally have some sort of discussion of meta-analyses in general and what they are, but I actually think that you all have a relatively good handle on what a meta-analysis is. So I'm going to kind of go very quickly through it, but overall, a meta-analysis is a study of studies where we kind of compound the effects of all of these studies and get an overall effect size for one dependent variable that we're normally looking at. In our case, it's this kind of fatigue dependent variable and its relationship to ego depleting tasks that may be associated with it. If you have any questions about meta-analyses in general, just know that again, it's just a study of studies where we get an overall effect size, and you can feel free to send me a quick email and I can give you a pretty good description. I can even send you some resourceful YouTube links as well. Again, this is just kind of a recap of what meta-analyses are. In general, our overall outcome from this is getting one generalized effect size. So the type of effect size that you can achieve from meta-analyses depends on the outcome overall. So if we are working with a outcome variable that is dichotomous, which means it's either coded as 0 or 1, we use logistic regression for that, and generally the agreed upon type of analyses for that can be either like a chi-square test or a logistic regression. Now, logistic regression is the generalized framework that you would work with a dichotomous outcome variable, and with those we generally achieve in odds ratios or a relative risk if it's more of a population related study. Whereas continuous data, where your outcome variable is continuous, it can be on some sort of Likert scale or scale from 0 to 100, 0 to 1,000, whatever. As long as it's continuous variable, we talk about things as standardized mean differences, otherwise known as Cohen's d, which is just the generalized effect size. Now, additionally, another aspect that you can get from meta-analyses are confidence intervals, and this is fine for dichotomous or continuous data. Each can produce some sort of confidence interval, where studies that have larger sample sizes result in smaller confidence intervals, which means more reassurance that we are in the realm of the correct point estimate, which is kind of the estimate that you come on. So you want to have smaller confidence intervals associated with your studies. So one of the most utilized graphing options in meta-analyses are something called forest plots, and that is exactly what this image is showing you to the right of your screen, is a forest plot. All a forest plot is a kind of estimate showing you what several studies, what kind of point estimates they've had and the confidence intervals associated with them, as well as the kind of study sample size. Now, the study sample size can be shown by how large the square boxes are there. So the larger the box, the larger of a sample size there is. The confidence intervals are represented by the lines. To the right, it shows how wide of confidence intervals there are. Now, you can kind of be rest assured that the smaller the sample sizes, likely the larger the confidence intervals will be. So we have less assurance that our point estimate is correct. And the point estimate is essentially where that box lines up. So as you can see, if the box lines up closer to 1, in this case it's being an odds ratio, then it is closer to an odds ratio of 1, indicating that there's no effect shown. Additionally, these will all be collated and kind of compressed into one generalized effect size, where larger studies, those with larger sample sizes, have a larger effect on the outcome of the overall summary measure, as can be seen by that kind of diamond at the bottom of the graph where it says summary measure. And what this is indicating is that these, let's see, there's 5 studies. These 5 studies overall have a average effect size with weighting in the sample size of each study of 2.2. So overall, we're seeing a generalized effect size of 2.2 from this, whatever this outcome variable is. Most studies are averaging out to that kind of odds ratio. So let's just go ahead and summarize what it is we've all talked about in this slide. So overall, ego depletion theory has been studied extensively for many years. There's been a lot of kind of research going opposing to what the original kind of Baumeister et al. Study was talking about in terms of physiological measures, and then we talk about it in terms of psychological measures. So what is the best practice? And it seems like a lot of these studies have failed to replicate the ego depletion study, either through physiological measures or psychological measures. So we can't really understand how ego depletion is, related to some of these kind of tasks at hand. And overall, we kind of ended off going kind of a segue into meta-analyses, in that meta-analysis is a method to examine overall effect sizes of different studies. So for next study, we have one reading for you to do. This is the Hager study, in which we talk about ego depletion, but this is in terms of meta-analytic review, right? So it's going to be compiling a series of studies all on ego depletion and seeing if we can come to an agreement on one kind of solid effect size that ego depletion has.